Minimum of 2. By Tim Winton. Chapter 7. Distant Lands. The girl they called Fat Maz worked in her father's news agency. Her father had a club foot and he was an angry man because the army had never wanted him. All day he clumped up and down between the racks of magazines, keeping an eye out for thieves and making sure people bought things instead of standing and reading for free. The girl's mother sat all day at the register and watched the cars pass. Once a day the big Greyhound rolled past going north to the city. Only the dull drumming of the Old National reminded the girl that her mother was there. She was always relieved when her parents went home for lunch and left the shop to her. Every day at the lunch hour, a tall dark man came in, paused for a moment just inside the door as if to adjust his eyes or to get his bearings, before heading straight to the paperback novel called Distant Lands, opened it, and with his foot up on the bottom shelf, read for 15 minutes. The first time he came in his reading was furtive. He spent as much time looking up to see if he was being watched as he did reading. His eyes showed white and worried over the burst of exotic purple on the cover, and to show that she couldn't have cared less, the girl smiled at him and shrugged. Interesting, she asked that first day as he walked out without spending a cent. The man said nothing. He just passed the register with his eyes downcast. When he got out into the street, he adjusted his tie, buttoned his jacket against the smelly harbor breeze, and went. After that, the man came again, but he did not look at the girl or give any sign of recognition. Her father would have thrown him out. Not only was he freeloading, she guessed he was a Pakistani too. His Nescafe hands were clean and well manicured. His suit was conservative and cut sharp. When she inspected Distant Lands, she saw that he marked his place with a long, black hair. The book looked as though it had never been opened. On the back cover, the blurb said, "You will want this book never to finish." As weeks passed, the girl wondered whether she should read Distant Lands for herself. The dark man seemed to draw such energy from it. She could see it in the way he buttoned his jacket against the wind each day. But the book was so long and she'd hardly read a book since leaving school, and, besides, she felt somehow as though it might be eavesdropping. For now, it was enough just to look forward to the lunch hour and that strange feeling of comradeship she felt when the dark man was in the shop. She was part of a conspiracy. For an hour, her rules were shop rules. Just watching him up the back with his polished shoe on the lower shelf and the gloss finish of his down-pointed brow shining in the fluorescent light gave her pleasure. She was not a sporty girl. She did not read. She had no boyfriend. Sometimes she would bicycle out to the edge of town and look along the highway. She felt herself growing fatter every day. She hated the smell of the harbor, and she often wondered whether she smelt of it after all these years. Several times she almost asked the man how the book was coming along, and once she nearly left the register to confront him, ask him why he read it at all, but even as she opened her mouth or got up from her seat, she knew she might spoil lunch hours for them both. For even though he never even met her gaze after the first day, and even though they'd never really conversed and he'd never actually bought a single item from the news agency, the girl knew they understood one another. She had never felt this tacit understanding with anyone before. Once, the dark man came in late. The girl's parents had come back from lunch. She felt her arse tighten. She saw the dark man walk down to the back, oblivious. She held her breath. But before he even touched Distant Lands, the man seemed to sense the girl's mother craning over the National, and he left immediately. He was back next day, dead on time. There was a more serious crisis. One day, a big red woman in a shiny cardigan brought Distant Lands to the register. At the time, the girl's mother was out on the pavement dragging in wet bundles of the daily news. "I'm sorry," the girl said. "That book's reserved." What's this, a library? The big red woman deepened a tone. It's on order. Sorry. It seemed desperately important to save it for tomorrow's lunch hour. It might take weeks to get another copy down from the city, and the thought of lunch hour, without a visit from the stranger, sent a gallop of panic through her. Haven't you got more? The big woman put a meaty, bearing hand upon the register. I'm really sorry. The woman stood there for a moment as though deciding tactics, but in the end she slapped the book down on the glass counter and rolled out. At the sight of the great rump in retreat, the girl felt fear. That could be me, she thought. It wasn't the fatness so much as the whatever it was that seemed so patently missing. The woman hadn't even really wanted the book, she began to suspect. Their little confrontation was just something to do. She watched her mother drag in the newspapers. Her father passed, throwing his foot angrily ahead of him. Outside, the greyhound was pulling away empty. As she helped close up that night, she felt the oddest seesawing inside her. By dinner it was gone, and she watched TV until she slept where she sat. Next morning she felt guilty. She had no friends, but her mother and father looked after her. They'd given her a job when she quit school, and jobs were impossible to get in this little town. Maybe things weren't as bad as all that. That day, the dark man came in as usual. Watching him read, she noted that he was not handsome, though she did not object to his color. His teeth had the look of polished rice. She felt a smile wedge her face as he turned a page. Was that little snapping movement in him excitement? Now she was happy, there was no doubt of it. This was happiness, not everything else. The shop was empty. There was only the dark man reading Distant Lands and her peering openly at him over the register. Nothing else but 1,000 garish glossy covers. He's happy, she thought, seeing him turn another page. As she watched, the Nescafe-colored man turned what she'd swear looked like the last page. Her throat closed, her heart off. She heard him sigh. She saw him shut the book and place it back on the shelf. She saw him coming to the register. His small teeth showed in a smile. "Thank you," he said. The girl opened her mouth. "And this is for the bus," he said, putting a note on her palm. "Goodbye." The girl they called Fat Maz watched him go out into the main street, turn his collar against the harbor wind, and go on his way. After a moment, she went down to the back of the shop. She was excited and confused. Distant Lands stood on the shelf. She picked up a long black hair. It was strong enough to wind around her finger like a tourniquet and turn the flesh blue. She stood with her back to the shelf and let out a grunt. The $50 note was starchy new. She stuffed it down her jumper and into her bra. Leaning against the shelf for a moment, she looked towards the door. When she breathed, the money sounded electric between her breasts. She met her parents at the door. She saw shadows in their brows. She fairly crackled.